ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Today I want to talk about a topic that is baffling to a lot of musicians. So baffling that many don't even get why they might want to understand it, and that is audio frequencies. Now, already we're sounding quite dry and scientific just by saying it, and audio frequencies are basically a sciencey view on music and sound. But that actually proves to be fascinating and quite powerful for a musician once you get your head around it. Now, this is one of those topics that is far too huge for a short podcast episode to really cover. We could literally do 100 episodes about audio frequencies and music. So I'm going to focus here on just the fundamental what and why of learning about frequencies, and we'll leave all of the how aside for now. But I will mention at the end a great free resource you can check out if you want to dive in. So let's begin with, why talk about audio frequencies at all on the Musicality podcast? Well, the first thing to say is that audio is just another word for sound. All music is experienced as sound, and audio frequencies are a particular way of analyzing, representing, and understanding what's going on in sound. You might have come across frequencies in your musical life in a few places already. We mentioned it in our previous episode on tone when talking about bass and treble, low frequencies and high frequencies. It came up in our interviews with Jeremy Fisher and Alan Hubert Wright, talking about how the human voice can do some interesting and unexpected things, and we can explain what's going on by looking at the frequencies. You might have seen the big mixer desk in a recording studio or at a live gig, where there are various sliders to control different frequencies. Or if you're an electronic musician or you've done some home recording, you've probably played around with equalizer settings or plug-in controls that are set in terms of frequency. In my experience, a lot of musicians bump up against this idea of frequencies and often figure out how to do what they need to do with the equipment they're using or wherever it's come up for them. But most don't take the time to actually look into this topic, which is a shame because there is a lot of exciting stuff that can be empowering to you as a musician. More on that later. So when I first learned about frequencies, it was in the context of a high school science class talking about waves in water, or a spring or a string bouncing and vibrating, or some really abstract stuff about how light works. And I was a geeky kid, so that stuff was interesting to me, and I kind of got that sound was about air vibrating, and that was a pressure wave, and it vibrated at a certain frequency. But I don't think it was until I got to university and studied physics and computer science and got into the nitty-gritty of frequency domain transformations and fast Fourier transforms and a bunch of other stuff that has intimidating names that I really got why frequency was so important for thinking about sound. And then when I did my master's, we really went deep into music specifically and this scientific view on what's happening in a musical sound. Actually, that's a bit of a lie. I did catch glimpses of why this stuff was cool earlier on. I remember spending lots of time fiddling with the EQ settings in Winamp to make my music sound better, and looking at the cool visualizations my computer could show based on the frequencies in the music. And I kind of got the idea that there were a lot of frequencies in music. It wasn't just that a sound wave had one frequency, which was how fast it vibrates the air. There was some way of looking at music that made it all about frequencies. So then at university, I learned all of the cool underlying maths and science, and I was lucky to do one of the only master's programs in the world that's focused on, essentially, the science and data of music. All that is to say, I am definitely biased. I love this stuff, but I definitely remember how baffling it used to be, and I'm happy to say that you definitely do not need to go as deep as all that for frequencies to be fascinating and useful to you as a musician. Okay, so what is a frequency? Well, it's the rate at which something happens. A low frequency means it's happening once in a while, and a high frequency means it's happening very often. And in the case of sound, we're talking about how often the air moves back and forwards in a wave. That back and forward motion hits our ear, and we perceive that as sound. We measure that rate in a unit called hertz, Hertz, where 1 hertz just means once per second, and 2 hertz means twice per second, and so on. Humans can hear air vibrating at roughly 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. It differs from person to person and with age, but that's a good rule of thumb to remember, 20 to 20,000 hertz. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We perceive low frequencies as a low pitch, and high frequencies as a high pitch. The relationship between pitch and frequency is actually a bit subtle. We might do a future episode all about that, but as a starting point, you can think of the range from low to high frequency as mapping to how we hear from low pitch up to high pitch. So let's hear an example, the simplest possible example. Here is a sound which actually does have just one frequency, like that science class explanation of how sound works. You might have actually heard of this one. It's called A440 because it's 440 hertz, and the pitch it produces is the note we call A. And here's 262 hertz, which is the pitch we call middle C. When a sound wave has just one frequency like this, it's called a sine wave, something you might have come across in maths class. And this pretty much never happens in real life. It's great as a demonstration and a tool for thinking about sound, but real sounds, and especially musical sounds, always have a mixture of frequencies in them, as if you've taken a bunch of these simple sine waves at different frequencies, some higher, some lower, and combined them all together. For example, if I add a few more frequencies into this sound, the A440, essentially taking several of these simple sine waves and playing them at the same time, you might hear this. Now, that's starting to sound a bit more like a musical note, right? If we add a fade in and a fade out, it actually sounds a bit like a note played on an oboe. Well, an oboe played on an early electronic synthesizer anyway. So every musical sound you actually hear in real life, from a single note on a wind instrument, which sounds a bit like a sine wave, through to every drum and cymbal in the percussion section, is made up of a mix of frequencies. On the percussion end of things, the sound becomes what's called noise, basically what happens when you throw not just a few frequencies together, but all frequencies, like this. That is called white noise, and noise is more interesting than you might think. That's another topic we might do an episode on in future. So all sounds exist somewhere on that range, from a single frequency through to the noise of all frequencies at once. Now that we've had a taste of audio frequencies and how they might relate to music, I'm going to hit pause, and we'll pick this up in a part 2 to talk about the 2 big reasons frequencies are important for musicians, and why you might want to learn a lot more about them.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. Head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for podcast listeners. That's musicalitypodcast.com.